pledged his allegiance, and the whole Ummah followed suit. So this is where the Ummah was united after the greatest tragedy had befallen it, right here in this garden. So now we're moving this way, inshallah. So the city of Medina is just where the people lived, where people had their homes. Rasul bought the land where the Masjid was built, and then the Sahaba started living around there. As for the Haram of Medina, and when I say the Haram, I mean the sanctuary where all the laws of the Haram apply, the holy land. That is what Rasul declared to be from Ayr, which is behind Uhud, that's the northernmost point, and Thur, which is a mountain at the south of Medina. And he said everything between Ayr and Thur is a haram, is a sanctuary. And some narrations even, so basically as Mecca is the haram of Ibrahim, he made dua for it and became a sanctified place. Rasul made dua for Medina. And in fact, he made double the dua, as you probably heard, double the dua for Medina. All the barakah that's in Mecca may double that be in Medina. And some narrations even state that every prophet has a haram. لِكُلِّ نَبِيٍّ حَرَمْ وَهَذَا حَرَمِي. For every prophet, there is a sanctuary, and this is my sanctuary, Medina. And that extends, like I said, from Ayr to Thur, and then in the east and the west, the borders of Medina are the two harras, because the Medina is described in the Torah as نَخْلَ بَيْنَ حَرَّتَيْنِ. It is described as a date garden between two harras. What is a harra? A harra is an area, if you're to look like a topographical map, it's an area of volcanic rock. Those are the eastern and western ends of Medina. So, which is greater, Mecca or Medina, one may ask? There is a legitimate difference of opinion between the scholars. Which is greater, Medina or Mecca? Some say Medina, some say Mecca. Some say Medina is greater than all of Mecca except where Masjid al-Haram is. Or Medina is greater than all of Mecca except where the Kaaba is. It is the opinion of Umar, his son, Abdullah ibn Umar, Imam Malik, that Medina is the greatest place in the world. Greater than even Mecca. The most holy land on the planet. For a number of reasons. Why? One, there is an authentic hadith that a whip span in Jannah is greater than all of the dunya and all it contains. And Medina has much more than a whip span. It has the Rawdah, which is from Jannah. It has the mountain of Uhud, which is from Jannah. It has the valley of Aqiq, which some narrators say is from Jannah. It has the mimbar of the Prophet, peace be upon him, which is resting upon his pool in Jannah. So all of these things. And there's a number of reasons. But the biggest, and another reason, for example, is that Rasul explicitly stated that whoever of you is able to die in Medina, then should die in Medina. This is the place where it's actually encouraged to come and live for religious reasons, that you will get ajr for coming and living here, reward from Allah. There is not a single hadith that encourages anybody to live in Mecca. In fact, some scholars say it's makruh. But the biggest reason that they say Medina is greater than even Mecca is because that this is the resting place of the Prophet, peace be upon him. This is the place that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala chose for his Prophet to be his home and final abode. And as we all know, human beings are created from clay. Specifically, according to authentic hadith, we are created from the same clay that we are buried in. The same clay that we are buried in. Minha khalaqnakum. From it we have created you. فيها نعيدكم, to it we will return you. ومنها نخرجكم تارة أخرى. And from it we will take you out once more. That being said, Ibn Sirin, who was a scholar from the Tabi'in, the second generation of Muslims, he said, لو حلفت لحلفت بارا صادقا غير شاك ولا مستثنى أن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم وأبا بكر وعمر خلقوا من طينة واحدة. If I was to take an oath, I would take a righteous oath and a pious oath without any doubt or exception whatsoever that the Prophet, peace be upon him, and Abu Bakr and Umar were all created from one clay. That is the clay of Medina, the greatest clay on earth. So moving on. From the virtues of Medina, how we can tell that Medina is very virtuous is that one may not ever hunt wild animals in Medina. One may not even scare wild animals in Medina. One may not even carry weapons to hunt. One may not chop down wild trees in Medina or Mecca. These are all laws that apply strictly for the harams, because these are known as holy lands and should be treated as such.
Excuse me. Question.
No, yeah, if you
Question.
find wild animals.
Question.
Even they'll count a locust.
Question. The haram you said it's all this around, so that if you pray in the hotel will be the same praying in the masjid.
Ah, that's a very good question. Now, there's a legitimate difference of opinion between the scholars in Mecca. If you get the salah multiplied by 100,000 inside Masjid al-Haram, or all the masjids inside the Haram. However, the hadith for Medina only applies to the masjid. Man salla fi masjidi hada. Whoever prays in this masjid, it will be multiplied by 1,000. No other masjid in Medina gets that multiplication, except, of course, if you're to play your nafil, your voluntary prayers in your hotel room, because Rasulullah said that's better to pray. The best place to pray your voluntary prayers are in your home, and then the best place to pray your obligatory prayers is in the masjid. Unless you're a woman, the best place is always to pray in your home, and they would get their salah multiplied in their homes, not for the men.
Why is it makruh to stay in
Some scholars say that because some scholars believe that sins also get multiplied in Mecca, the same way rewards do, about 100,000. So it's something you have to be aware of. Now, or of King Fahd. King Fahd. King Fahd Gate. It's in the middle. There's a lot of king gates.
It's King Fahd, yes.
Yes, King Fahd. So if you're to enter through it, it's a men's entrance. If you're to enter through it, or somehow a woman find her way in, if you're to enter through the men's entrance, and then it's the most left door of the King Fahd doors, and then take a left before you hit the wall, the barrier between the men and the women, the wooden barrier. If you were to look on the ground, on the tiles, there'd be three circular tiles. Sometimes it's covered by carpet, sometimes not. The significance of those tiles is to indicate the place where the well of Bayruha used to be. The well of Bayruha. The well of Bayruha, there were 7 known wells that the Prophet, that were in Medina, that the Sahaba and the Prophet, peace be upon him, drank from in his lifetime. One of them was Bayruha. It was known to have cold, sweet water. And it belonged in the garden of a Sahabi. His name was Abu Talha. He was known as Abu Talha. So the whole garden belonged to him. It was also known as Bayruha, and the well belonged to him. Now the significance of the well is that when the ayah came down, لَن تَنَالُوا الْبِرَّ حَتَّى تُنْفِقُوا مِمَّا تُحِبُّونَ. You will never attain piety until you spend that which you love. Not that which is convenient, not that which is old and you don't use anymore, until you spend that which you love. So Abu Talha, and mind you, he was Ansari, and the staple of the Ansar's economy were their gardens. So this might have very well been the majority of his wealth, who knows? But when he heard this ayah, he immediately said, how am I going to implement it? So he went to the Prophet, peace be upon him, and he said, is this true? And he verified, is this ayah true? And he said, yes. They said, I take you to bear witness that I donate my whole garden, Bayruha, and everything in it, fi sabilillah. I give it to Allah and His Messenger. So like that, he immediately implemented the ayah. A little bit about Abu Talha himself. One may ask, story. Abu Talha actually came into Islam for an insincere reason. The story goes that when the Prophet, peace be upon him, first came to Medina, there were people that, of course, lots of people that were Muslim from the Ansar, but there were still some people that were left on their kufr. They weren't Muslim yet. They were still upon the religion of paganism. And from them was Abu Talha. And he was a wealthy guy and what have you, so he was comfortable. But Sulaym, I'll mention where she was. Sulaym was a believer. And she was recently widowed, so she was available to be married again. So Abu Talha proposed. But she was a believing woman, she was a mu'mina, and he was a mushrik, he was a pagan, so naturally she refused. So Abu Talha, being a wealthy guy, what have you, he wasn't easily refused. So he started making lines of poetry about her. I'm paraphrasing, mind you, but he's like, this woman's nothing but a gold digger, what have you, she wants nothing but gold and silver, she's not, and actually making lines of poetry against her. So naturally she was very insulted. So she said, Wallahi, nothing is stopping me from marrying you except your kufr, except your disbelief. So he's like, okay, whatever, call your bluff. Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah, ashhadu anna Muhammadan Rasulullah. So she's like, okay, I marry you. So then the Sahaba would afterwards say that the person with the greatest mahar, the greatest dowry, was Sulaym. Because her mahar was the Islam of Abu Talha, who became very righteous afterwards. He was one of the few that stayed with Rasul during Badr, protecting him. During his last years, he fasted every single day of his life except Eid. He died as a mujahid fi sabilillah. He died as a shaheed. When he died of natural causes, he was on the ship. They couldn't find a place to bury him for 8 days. 8 days they finally came to some land and they were able to bury him. They said his body did not change in the least. It just looked like he was sleeping. Because Allah does not let the bodies of the martyrs or the prophets decompose. Now looking towards the Masjid here for a second. Architecture is kind of parallel. They took that from the Andalusian architecture. If you were to look at the old Cordoban mosques and what have you, it's kind of the old Islamic heritage. But the reason I indicate is because everyone knows how that blue and white arc. If you were to keep going in, it would eventually be, that blue, first of all, is to indicate the expansion of King Fahd, the King Fahd of the Saudi kings. Then if you were to keep going in, it would become burgundy trim. It would become a white and burgundy trim. And that's to indicate the expansion of King Abdul Aziz, one of the first Saudi kings. And then if you're to keep going into the road and what have you, you just notice a significantly older architecture, and that's from the Uthmani Empire, the Ottoman Empire. So, because like I said, Medina was mentioned in the Torah. And they knew that this was going to be the place of the coming of the final prophet, peace be upon him. So they started settling here very early. Some people say as early as the initial banishment of the people of Musa for 40 years in the desert. As early as that time, Jews may have started inhabiting Medina, but they were the first. After, it was the Arabs that came. It was a flood in Yemen that happened. If you could read about in the tafsir of Surah Saba, there was a giant flood in Yemen, and the Yemenis, who being the original Arabs, they started spreading to different places in the Arabian Peninsula. Some of them settled in Medina, and these became the forefathers of the Ansar. And the Ansar were two major tribes. Aus and Khazraj. I want you guys to remember that. Aus and Khazraj. Okay? Two names. By the way, I'm going to throw a lot of names at you guys. A lot. I don't expect you guys to memorize them all. However, if one story touches your heart, if one Sahabi piques your interest, ask me later, who was this Sahabi? Who was that? And so and so. Because, this is like your forefathers in the deen. This is our history. This is who we are. The more you learn about them, the more you learn about yourself. The more you can hold your chin up in pride, because these are who we look at back. If you're coming from the West, chances are your head, mashallah, tabarakallah, is filled with useless garbage. Stuff you'll never need in the dunya or the akhirah. You don't need to know where Brad Pitt is adopting from this year. You don't need to know what Lindsay Lohan is putting in her nose this week. You don't need to know all of this stuff. It will not benefit you in the dunya or the akhirah. What will benefit you is finding out who your forefathers are in the deen, the Sahaba. Who are they? Memorize one name. Okay, so like I said, it was the Aus and the Khazraj. Alright, and while they were there, Aisha described Medina as being Oba al-Ard, the most desolate of lands. People actually tried to avoid Medina because it was known if you came to Medina, it was likely that you'd be stricken with a fever. It was notorious for this reason. And between the Aus and the Khazraj, who by the way, they're actually brother tribes, but for some small stupid reason, some small piece of wealth, like a well or a camel or what have you, some people got into an argument, one guy killed another guy, his tribe ended up killing a bunch of his tribe, and then a blood feud started, like the Bloods and the Crips today, if you will. So this blood feud lasted for years and years and generations. Particularly 5 years before the hijrah of the Prophet, peace be upon him, there was the war known as the War of Wabal. There was many battles, but this particular battle, Harb al-Wabal, a lot of the Ansar died. A lot of the Aus and the Khazraj died. And Aisha describes it, actually saying that when we were in Mecca, the most adamant people against Islam were who? The wealthy and the elite. Because if you're in the top 1%, if you will. Because if you're in the top 1%, you really don't need things to change. You don't need, the wealth to be distributed amongst the poor. You don't need that. You don't need a fair justice system. You don't need that. You want things to just stay there where they are, and you have your slaves and your wealth and everyone below you. So that's why the biggest enemies of Islam were the wealthy and the elite. Abu Jahl, Umayyah ibn Khalaf, Ubay ibn Khalaf, Abu Lahab, all these guys were wealthy, elite status people in Mecca. However, in Medina, these big leaders, the big leaders of Aus and Khazraj, most of them had died through the wars, and particularly War of Wabat. It was just who? It was the regular guy like me and you, who just wanted to live, wanted a new life, wanted a way out. Everyone had a cousin at this point, or a brother, or a relative that had died in the war, and they were just sick of it. Enter Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam at this time, yearly during Hajj, for any of you who have made Hajj, you see, or if you look at pictures of Mina, you see all those tents. Because the Arabs, they used to pitch their tents as well, even before Islam. And they made their Hajj based on the Sunnahs of Ibrahim. So, it was Rasulullah and Abu Bakr, they would go to the different tents. And Abu Bakr was an expert in genealogy, so he would introduce. He'd say, oh, you're from so-and-so tribe. We're from Quraysh. Did you know that we're related from this guy and this guy and this guy and this guy? Yeah, we're related. This is Muhammad, by the way, and he has a message. And then Rasulullah would, start talking about Islam and La ilaha illallah and what have you, and reject it, and reject it, and reject it, year after year. Some tribes would be harsh. Some would say, make fun of him. Some would just listen to Abu Lahab. They say, if his uncle's making fun of him, how we're going to listen to him. Some would even say, what you're saying is right. What you're saying is the truth. However, we can't protect you. We're too weak. Or, however, we're under the alliance of Persia, or under the alliance of Rome, or what have you. It was the Ansar. It was the Shabab, the young guys of the Ansar as well. They embraced this message, and they said, yes, we're going to accept this. So then they listened to it 1 year, and then the next year they brought 90 of the Ansar. And then they were to take the allegiance. And before they took the allegiance, in Aqaba, in Mina, in the place of, that's why it's called the Pledge of Aqaba. Abbas, the uncle of the Prophet, peace be upon him, he said, no, Khazraj. He called them Khazraj even though it was Aus and Khazraj. Khazraj were the majority. So he said, no, O Khazraj, that if you're to take this man in, because the oath was specifically stated that they would take Muhammad in and they would protect him the same way they protect their women and their children. They will put their lives on the line for this man. So he said, no, Khazraj, if you take this man, all the Arab are going to be against you. The red and the black, meaning every single race, are going to fight you for this man, for holding up his message. So the Ansar said, what's in it for us? All Rasulullah said is Al-Jannah, paradise. He said, right. He took the Pledge of Allegiance. And that's what Medina was built upon. It was built upon Iman. It was built upon that nusra, the assisting Rasulullah's message. Because it wasn't the first place of Hijrah. It wasn't the first place of Hijrah. Habasha was the first place. And Habasha had equity, it had justice, it had peace. But it didn't assist that message. It didn't take that light of La ilaha illallah and let it see the four corners of the earth. It was Medina. It was the Ansar that did it. And that's why every single Muslim has that love for Medina till now. Because this is the foundation of Medina. Faith and assisting the message of Rasulullah. Now, I'm going to start mentioning a bunch of Sahaba's houses. You can tell because it's open area with umbrellas and what have you. That general area is where Abdullah ibn Mas'ud used to live. Abdullah, the son of Mas'ud. Abdullah, the son of Mas'ud, was first of all, he was known as one of the greatest qadis of Islam. Rasulullah said, whoever of you wishes to hear the Quran fresh, as the same way it came down upon, so let him read the qira'ah of Abdullah ibn Mas'ud. Now, and even today, if you're to look at the chain of narrators, if someone's to become a hafiz, like the brother's son, mashallah, he has a son that's a hafiz, mashallah. If you were to look at the chain of narrators, he learned the Quran from so-and-so, from so-and-so, from so-and-so. A lot, if not the majority, actually go back to Abdullah ibn Mas'ud. So he gets the reward for that. Now, he was specifically a mawla, meaning he did not have a real tribe when he was in Mecca. He was in Mecca at the time. He was a mawla. He was of lower social status, if you will. And he was poor, so he worked as a shepherd, and he took other people's sheep, and he used to graze them around. So, one particular day, Rasulullah came, him and Abu Bakr, and they were walking, and happened to pass by him, and they were very thirsty and hungry. So they asked Abdullah, Mr. Shepherd, may we have to drink from some of your sheep? So he said, these aren't my sheep, I have no right to give you the milk. So Rasul said, okay, how about you show me a sheep that doesn't give milk anyway? So that he's like, okay. So Rasul, prophetic miracle, he started rubbing the udders of one of the sheep, that sheep, and then mashallah it became full of milk. So they milked it and they all had to drink. And Abdullah, he was a slick kid. So before they started walking away, he was like, hey, show me how you did that. So then they started explaining, got into it, la ilaha illallah, Rasulullah, what have you. He accepted Islam. And he was one of the very, very, very early Muslims. In fact, when the Muslims became 40 in number, Rasul he said, it is time for Quraysh to hear the Quran. Because they never heard it in public at this point. It was all very, very secretive. It was just Rasul and his personal friends or friends of friends like that. So Abdullah, by the way, Abdullah was a very small guy. In fact, some narrations say Abdullah standing was as tall as some of the Sahaba sitting. And he was also very skinny. In one narration, Abdullah was climbing a tree to get some miswak. And while he was up in the tree, the wind blew and, it kind of blew his thobe up a little bit. So, the Sahaba started pointing and, smiling, and they're like, look at Abdullah, his cute little legs, tiny legs. So the Rasul said, see those legs? He said, those legs are going to be heavier than Mount Uhud Yawm al-Qiyamah. Because Allah doesn't look at our colors and our bodies. Allah looks at our hearts and at our actions. So little Abdullah said, me, I'm going to be the first one to recite Quran in public. And everyone's like, yo, Abdullah, don't worry, chill out. And he's like, no, he insisted. I'm going to be the first. He wanted the ajr. He wanted to be the pioneer. So he insisted. He said, I'm going to do it. So they're like, okay, they'll let him. So he went to the marketplace, where all Quraysh was, and started reciting. Ar-Rahman, allama al-Qur'an, khalaqa al-insan, allamahu al-bayan. All of Quraysh froze. Because I have to remind you that the Arabs at this time, they regarded linguistics as the highest form of human intellect. The same way we regard scientific achievements as the highest form of human intellect. We have the yearly awards and these prizes and what have you for scientific achievements. They similarly had yearly competitions, yearly awards. Who was the best poet? Who was the best speech giver? They had, the best poems, they hung them up on the Kaaba itself. It was almost a deen to them. It was almost religion. So when they heard the Quran, they knew. You guys can come if you want. It's free. It's no problem. So they knew that this is not the word of man. We know the language inside and out. We know the best of Arabic. This is too good to be the word of men. Even Kuffar stated this. So all Quraysh froze when they heard these words. So now Abu Jahl, seeing everyone pay attention to this little Abdullah, of course, like we mentioned, he didn't like the change in the status quo, what have you. So he's a coward because he's Abu Jahl and Abdullah's a little guy. He goes up to Abdullah, slaps him in the ear. He slaps him so hard that his ear starts bleeding. And he goes and he's running back to Rasul and he's crying, and he's saying, and Rasul sees him crying, tears flowing and his blood flowing, and he starts crying and he hugs Abdullah, and then he starts smiling. And then he said, Messenger of Allah, why are you smiling? And he said, because Jibreel alayhi salam just came to me and he told me an ear for an ear and the head is extra. What that means, you have to ask me at the end of the tour. I don't know if you guys really care or not. So, Rasul actually, when he made migration, he came from Mecca, which lies in relative to Medina. Where's Mecca?
South.
Very good. So the most southern place in Medina, where people were living at that time, was actually Quba. So he stayed there for a week or 10 days, and that's why he built Masjid Quba first, and that's why here it's the first masjid in our Islam. He later on came to the main city of Medina. And while he was coming, the Ansar all wanted to have the bragging rights of having the Prophet stay in their hood, their neighborhood. So when the Prophet came, all of them started grabbing the reins of the camel and saying, stay with us, stay with us. We have numbers, we have power, we have weapons, whatever. We'll take care of you. Stay with us, stay with us. But he was very particular about the sensitivities of people, and he did not want to play favorites. Sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. Is that useful for me, or did I just interesting? Okay. All right, so now, so he didn't want to play favorites. He didn't want to stay with a particular tribe. So he said, when they were tugging on the reins of his camels, he said, leave it because it has its orders. So the camel started roaming the streets of Medina. And it walked, 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 until it settled right where the member is today. Right where the member is today. And then it got up. And it walked, and it walked, and it walked. And it settled down on the same spot, as if making sure. So then Rasulullah said, whose land is this? And then they said, it belongs to two orphans from the tribe of Khazraj. So he bought the land from them, and he started building the masjid, and also his houses, who shared a wall with the masjid, and he stayed in Abu Ayyub al-Ansari's house at the time, and that's where I'll point out to where that was. And then he allocated some of the land around the masjid to where the Sahaba, for some of the Sahaba that were coming from Mecca. So some of the Sahaba who could afford it, they took that land and they built their homes. All the Sahaba who could not build their own houses, Rasul partnered them up. He did mu'akhra. He established a brotherhood. He partnered them up with a brother from the Ansar. So Abdurrahman, when he came to his brother from the Ansar, the famous quote, the Ansari said, look, Abdurrahman, this is my wealth. These are my two wives. I'll split my wealth in half. You can have half of it. And whatever my wives you like, I'll divorce her and you can marry her. All Abdurrahman said was, Barakallah fi ahlik wa malik. May Allah put blessings in your wealth and in your family. Just put me out to the marketplace. Because he was a smart guy. And all he started off with was a piece of butter or a piece of cheese, whatever. And he started trading. Buy this, sell that, buy this, sell that. Boom, he became one of the richest guys in Medina. And he was particularly known for his sadaqah. He was particularly known for his generosity, his giving wealth fi sabilillah. And he gave and he gave and he gave. One day, in fact, in the time of Umar or Uthman, all of Medina actually started rumbling. So the people came out to see why was the earth rumbling? And they saw a huge caravan, all camels lined up, all of them carrying the goods of Abdurrahman ibn Auf, and he gave them all fi sabilillah to feed the people. And Rasul made dua for his wealth. He made dua. He said, may Allah put barakah in his wealth. He said after Rasul made that dua, he said, I could hardly turn over a stone without finding gold or something underneath. Because he had barakah in the wealth. And Rasul also one day, he was a little bit late for Salah. He was a little bit late. And Abdurrahman had already started leading the people. He'll keep walking. So Abdurrahman already started leading the people, and then Rasul he followed behind Abdurrahman. So then he said, a prophet does not die until he is led by a pious person from his nation in Salah. And that was Abdurrahman ibn Auf. So he lived in that general area. Now Abu Hurairah, he was one of the greatest narrators of hadith. He narrated some of the most hadith. He was one of the top guys. And mind you, he was only with Rasul for about 3 or 5 years max. But he stuck around him. He was a full-time student, if you will. Rasul he says, describing himself, he says, while the Ansar had their gardens, and while the Muhajirin had their business, because they were from Mecca and they were natural businessmen. You know, if you read the tafsir of Surah Quraysh, they would go between Yemen and Sham, and they would trade. They were traders. He said, so while the Muhajirin had their trade, and while the Ansar had their gardens, he said, as for me, I spent all my time just following Rasulullah, full-time student. And that being said, he had no income. So he says, I was so hungry. He says, some days I was so hungry, I would fall on the ground and actually start having a seizure. And people thought I was losing my mind, I've lost consciousness. And they thought at that time the way to address it was to apply pressure to the neck. So he said people would see me having my seizure and put their feet on my neck, start putting pressure on my neck, thinking it was madness. He says, Wallahi, it wasn't madness, it was nothing but hunger. And he said, and one narration, interesting story, one particular day, because he was from the people of the Saf. Like I said, first, whoever had money, Rasul allocated them to the land and they could build their homes. Otherwise, he partnered them with the Ansari houses. Otherwise, after the Ansari houses became full, and this is later stages of Medina, where Abu Hurairah came in, they just put the homeless people lived inside the Masjid, in the back of the Masjid, and that was called the people of the Saf. And from them was Abu Hurairah. Rasul would go to them every day, and he would sit with them and eat with them and teach them. So one day, Abu Hurairah came. No, he was outside. Again, he was very hungry. So he and he was very modest. So he didn't like to ask people for money. So he was hoping he could strike up a conversation with somebody, and then maybe that someone would invite them to his house, and he could, have food with them. So he saw Abu Bakr, and he's like, "Hey, Abu Bakr, there's this ayah. What do you think about this ayah? This, and that." And then Abu Bakr didn't get the message, so he was just like, "Yeah, this, that." So, and then he saw Umar, and he's like, Umar, what do you think of this ayah right here? And what do you think this means? And then Umar's like, "Yeah, it means this, that." And then Abu Bakr, shoot, he's stuck. So then he sees Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam sees him, and he just starts smiling. Like I said, very particular about the sensitivities of the people. He knew Abu Hurairah wanted, so he said, "Abu Hurairah, come," and he invited him to his house. And he said, "Bring all of the people of the Saf." And then he's like, "Okay, shoot, now how am I going to eat all the people of the Saf?" And then he had some milk. He had a bowl of milk, Rasulullah. So he said, "Abu Hurairah, give the people to drink." And then again, he was like, shoot, because he knew, out of tradition, if you're the one giving people to drink, you're the last to drink. So he starts giving the people to drink. And as a prophetic miracle, every time someone gave someone to drink, it didn't deplenish the milk. It was enough for everybody. And when it finally came around to Abu Hurairah, he said it looked like it was untouched. So Rasulullah said, "Abu Hurairah, drink." And he drank. And he said, "Abu Hurairah, drink." And he drank. He said, "Abu Hurairah, drink." He said, "Messenger of Allah, I can't drink anymore. My ribs are aching." This is one of the miracles of the Messenger of Allah. Now, everyone see it? Okay. That's known today as Masjid al-Ghamama. Masjid al-Ghamama, Masjid of the Cloud. Masjid of the Cloud. Reason it is called that is because this is a place where they used to pray the rain prayer. So naturally, the dua is being accepted instantly. Whenever they would make the rain prayer, the clouds would instantly start forming and the rain would come. So it's called now it's called the Masjid of the Cloud. It's also the place where they prayed their 2 Eid prayers. They prayed it here because it was a big, open, vast area. And the masjid at that time was small. So they rented it, they kind of used this land, and for that reason they called it Al-Musalla. They called it Al-Musalla. The same way we rent stadiums or whatever back home to, accommodate everyone. Which goes to show that this was open land. It means the city ended here. There was nothing after this. All the city was here. So the city of Medina was actually very, very small. It's just where the masjid or wherever in the plaza is today. All this was an open area where Sahaba may have lived with their, animals or on their, date farms or what have you. And even till very, very recently, Medina was very small. In fact, one of our teachers in the university, he says, recalling his grandmother when she married his grandfather, and his grandmother was in the place of Medina, the main city of Medina, and his grandfather, you guys been to Qiblatain yet? Yeah. His grandfather lived in the area of Qiblatain, the place where Banu Salama used to live. So when they got married, the daughter's family was like to the friends of the daughter's family said to the daughter's family, "Why did you marry your daughter to someone that lives in the end of the world?" Because Medina was very small. That's why it's called Meskina. It's called, it's very small. Meskina. So moving on, the well was called Ruma, the well of Ruma. Rasulullah said because the Muslims didn't have a water source, and the Jew who owned it was very, very, conniving, and he said, "Whoever wants a pail of water, give me equal to that a pail of dates," which is ridiculously expensive, naturally. So for water. So then Rasulullah said, "Who's going to buy this well?" and I guarantee him Jannah. So then, Uthman said to himself, I'm going to do it. And like Uthman and Abdul Rahman ibn Auf, they were the two big businessmen in Medina. Very, very smart. Which goes to show, if you have a skill, regardless of what that skill is, you don't have to be good at giving khutbahs, you don't have to be, I don't know. It doesn't have to be anything in particular. If you're good at anything, mashallah, you guys have skills in medicine. If you're good at arts, if you're good at computer technology, if you're good at anything, say to yourself, how can I benefit the Muslims? How can I benefit the Ummah of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam? So Uthman was good at business. So he asked the Jew, I want to buy this wall. The Jew obviously said some ridiculous price. So then he said, okay, how about I buy half the well? Meaning, I have it for a day and you have it for a day. So naturally he gives it for a much lower price. So then, when it was Uthman's day, he was like, okay, everyone drink for free. So then, everyone started taking 2 days worth of water. He ran the Jew out of business and bought it for a much cheaper price. Very smart guy. And that well is called the Well of Ummah. So Uthman was one of the first to quench the thirst of the Muslim. And now you'd eventually see on the top of the pillars a green and golden semicircle that says Hada Had Masjid Rasulillah. This is the original border of the Masjid of the Prophet. Because it was actually Umar and Uthman who expanded it towards the west and to the south. They're the only people in history, no one after Uthman actually expanded the Masjid towards the south. Later on, some kings came and expanded it towards the east. The Sahaba didn't actually like that idea because that ended up incorporating the houses of the Prophet into the Masjid. And the Sahaba actually said we'd prefer that they keep the houses of the Prophet so everyone see how humbly he lived. Because his houses were actually all very small. They were what we would consider a tiny room, actually. And then afterwards, all the expansions later to the back came. Now the first door, everyone see the door in the corner?
That's the Rahman door, right?
No, not the chandelier. On the left of the chandelier, the closed door. Closed door. Okay, that door is known as the door of Hijrah. Door of Hijrah. If you were to walk through that door, you'd be actually walking through the houses of many of the Sahaba. And amongst them would be Hassan ibn Thabit. Hassan, the son of Thabit. Hassan, Rasul first of all, actually to talk about the environment at the time. Remember we're talking about the Arabs and linguistics and what have you. Now, they regarded linguistics as very powerful, so the status of a poet was very important. And Hassan was one of the poets. See, because the poet was the media. He was the media. This is before the news and internet and radio and TV. If you wanted to get word out, you just pay a poet. If you wanted to shame a whole tribe, pay a poet. If you wanted to honor a tribe, pay a poet. If you wanted to start a war, pay a poet, because this is media. If you wanted to bring peace between warring tribes, pay a poet. Poets were very critical. They were the media at that time. So when the pagan poets of Mecca started insulting Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he said he wanted to see who would respond. So first Abdullah ibn Rawaha came, and he said his poetry. And Rasulullah was like, oh, okay, it's good, but, what else? And then Ka'b ibn Malik came. And then he said it's better, but still. And then Hassan came, and he said his poetry, his response to the Meccans. And it's in the biography of Ibn Hisham, and he just lays them out dirty. It's in Arabic. He calls them a bunch of women. You guys are cowards. You guys are nothing. You two in war. Blah 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 blah. And they had no response. And he also had many poems praising the Prophet peace be upon him and his prophetic qualities. And Rasulullah said, as long as you make this poetry in my praise, Allah will assist you with the Holy Spirit Jibreel, Ruh al-Qudus. And he even made for him a special spot in the masjid, solely for him to recite this poetry. Also, again, if you keep going through those houses, through those doors, you would be going through the house of Tamim al-Dari. Okay, just to let you guys know, seriously. walking through those doors. You would eventually be walking through the doors of the house of Tamim al-Dari. Tamim al-Dari. He was another Sahabi. Tamim al-Dari was actually a Palestinian. He was a Palestinian and he was a Christian. As the brother mentioned, mashallah. And he was a sailor by trade. And one particular day, his ship ended up getting caught up in a storm, and the storm lasted for days and days and days, more than a month. And he crash landed on an island, and he met a very hairy creature, and he was actually the one that ended up meeting Dajjal, the Antichrist. And later on, he came to Rasulullah, and Rasulullah called all the Sahaba to the Masjid, and it wasn't even Salah time. And he said, this is Tamim al-Dari. His narration of the Antichrist is in accordance to what I've told you about the Antichrist. And that long narration. And Tamim al-Dari was also the first one. You see these nice chandeliers and lights inside the Masjid. He was the first one to bring light to the Masjid of Rasulullah. There was one particular night, Rasulullah came home and he saw, because he was right next to the Masjid, a light coming from the Masjid. And he said, who did this? And he said, it was Tamim al-Dari. He came from Sham, Palestine. He bought a bunch of wax and bought a bunch of strings and made candles and tied them on the pillars and brought light to the Masjid, lighted them at night. So he said, Nawwarahu, Nawwarahu. He enlightened it, may Allah enlighten it. This is the way Allah recompenses our deeds with His rewards. So he said, if I had a daughter, I would marry her to him today. Then later on, one of the Sahaba, and he didn't have a daughter because they're all married. He said, one of the Sahaba later on heard this. He said, Rasulullah, again, very quick, to just try to please Rasulullah and follow his suggestions, not even his orders. He said, Rasulullah, I have a daughter. Should I marry her to him? He said, yes, and he did. Tamim al-Dari also, particularly, he was known for his ibadah, his worship. He was known to be a very, very devout worshiper. In fact, if you read the stories, if you read the biographies of the Tabi'een, the second generation of Muslims, and you read the biographies of Sahaba, first generation of Muslims, you'd usually see that the Tabi'een, the second generation, usually have more salah, more sadaqah, more fasting, Quran, what have you. Why? Because they were trying to catch up with the Sahaba. They said, we want to show Allah that there's still men on this earth. And they said, because they have the honor of protecting and being with the Prophet, we want to catch up with them. And so they would try to do more fasting, more praying. But they said, even the most adamant worshippers from amongst the Tabi'in, they said, the one Sahabi we could never beat was Tamim al-Dari. No matter how much we fasted, he would be fasting. No matter how much we prayed, he would be praying more. He even bought a thobe, mashallah, maybe thousands of gold and dinars he spent on this thobe, and he only wore it for tahajjud, just so he could stand in front of Allah. So, he's a Muslim. Oh yeah, sorry, he was a Muslim. Yeah, he was a Christian, and then when he met Rasulullah, they came into Islam maybe the same day or maybe a day apart. They were maybe from amongst the first 10 Muslims. They came into Islam when they were young, maybe 13, 14, in Mecca. In fact, Zubayr, he was he was the first person to actually raise a sword in the name of Allah. It was in Mecca when he heard a rumor that Rasulullah had been assassinated or murdered at Quraysh. He took his sword out and he started roaming through the streets of Mecca, just a teenager. And he said, if I hear this rumor is true, I'm going to single-handedly fight all of Quraysh. But then he found out the rumor wasn't true. In any case, they grew up to be very, very fierce warriors. And they attended Badr and Uhud and all the battles, and later on. And in fact, one of the stories of Zubayr, one time it was a particular battle against the Romans or the Persians, not sure. But it was kind of a stalemate between the Muslims and the enemy army. And it wasn't really going anywhere. So then, Zubayr, he said, who's going to take an oath with me to fight to the death till Allah gives us martyrdom, And then he had about 100 or so of the Sahaba or Tabi'een. They took the oath with him. We're going to fight to the death till Allah gives us martyrdom. And they went into the enemy army. And they fought and they fought and they fought and they fought until they all gained Shahada. And then some of the Sahaba started, getting saddest because there goes Zubayr, it's done. And then the only one that came back was Zubayr. He was the only one that survived. And then again, and of course he was wounded, whatever. And now he was like, all right, who's ready to take an oath to the death? And this time no one answered. They were like, okay, Jazakallah khair. In any case, he had between arrow and sword and spear. And Rasul after that day would say, whoever of you wishes to see a living martyr, a martyr, a shaheed walking on this earth, look at Talha. And when the Sahaba would recall the day of Uhud, they would say that was the day of Talha. And they both lived together, lived around the same area, and they died at the same time, and they were assassinated by the same group of people. That was what Talha and Zubair lived. Now around where those white pillars are, is where Ummrah's house used to be. Ummrah's house. It was known as, of course we all know about Umar, many stories about Umar, but the number one thing I think I like to mention about Umar, and they say his number one characteristic was his justice. His justice. In fact, his house was called Dar al-Qada. What does Qada mean in Arabic? It means justice, it can mean judgment, justice. And I thought his house was called Dar al-Qada, the place of Qada, because he was just. It was actually called Dar al-Qada because another one of the meanings of Qada is to pay off one's debt. To pay off one's debt. So when Umar who died, at the end of his khilafah, he was getting assassinated, he told his son and his daughter, Abdullah and Hafsa, he said, sell my house, because he had a lot of personal debt. He said, sell my house. If that doesn't pay it off, ask my immediate family. If that doesn't pay off, our immediate tribe, and then our further tribe, and so on and so forth. He went into personal debt. Why? To help the people of his ummah, to get things done in the ummah or the armies, or to help the poor people. He went into personal debt for his people. At the end of his reign, he was in personal debt. What's usually the norm? If you find a leader is done being the leader of his people, it's usually the country that's in debt because of his personal spendings. But that's the justice of Umar. Now that first door right there is the door of Salam. It wasn't actually there in the time of the Prophet, peace be upon him. Like I said, that's a southern expansion from the time of Umar. And that's actually where some of the Sahabas lived, and I'll mention some of the Sahaba that lived in that area. Now, you see what happens is, those guys. You see that car right there with the yellow lights? Well, it could happen, but they're gonna it's gonna ruin the movie, personally. Anyway, but feel free when you guys afterwards to go in by the ones and twos and see all the spots. But so that second door right there, the first door is Bab Salam. The second door immediately, that whole area is called the doors of Abu Bakr Siddiq. Okay? So if you're to enter through the second door, and you're to keep walking straight, okay, until it says this is the masjid, the border of the Masjid of Rasulullah, you are standing now exactly in the house of Abu Bakr. Exactly. How do we know this? Because he was the last Sahabi to have a house that opened the door, that had a door that opened towards the masjid. Other Sahaba did have houses, but Rasul ordered all their doors to be closed and shut, and only Abu Bakr's to be left access to the masjid, insinuating that he wanted him to be the imam afterwards. So like I was mentioning,
Door of Salam.
many Sahaba. One of the first houses you'll be walking by or through, is the house of Ammar ibn Yasir. Ammar ibn Yasir. Ammar ibn Yasir, he was again a certain person that had no tribe, came to Islam in Mecca, so he was of lower social status. So when the Quraysh tortured him, he had no one to help him out.
Wow.
In fact, they tortured him and his whole family. They would beat him and abuse them, and he was actually the one that the ayah came down about, that if you're forced to say words of disbelief, but your heart is still full of iman, Allah forgives them. That ayah came particularly down upon Ammar. And his mother Sumayya was the first Shaheeda, the first martyr in all of Islam, because she died while being tortured. Because she refused to give in. So that's where Ammar lived. And another ayah that came down upon Ammar, by the way, something I'd like to touch upon, is that ayah that commanded Rasul to not turn away from these people. And don't turn away from the Qur'an. Because some of the Quraysh came. This is Surah Al-An'am, you can read it in the tafsir. They came to Rasul and he was sitting with Ammar, and he was sitting with Bilal, when he was sitting with these people that had no tribe, no social status, what have you, different races, foreigners, funny accents, if you will. Suhaib goes from rooms, right? A funny accent. You know, he was with these people of lower social status. So some of the big shots from Quraysh said, "What are you doing sitting with these guys? You're from tribe so and so." He said, "If you kick these people out, we'll come and sit with you." And then Allah sent that ayah down that don't turn your faces away from these poor people or what have you, because He recalled their status with Allah, because they remember Allah in the night and the day, which is something I'd like to draw attention to. People coming from the West, this means you. People of higher social status, this means you. People that are in the top 1% of wealth in the world, this refers to you. If you have over $100,000 and you have no debts, you're actually one of the top 1% wealthy people in the world. So this means you do not look down upon the poor people, especially newer converts in Islam. And I see this a lot in the West. A guy comes, maybe has drug addictions, maybe still has a girlfriend, maybe has funny hair, he has all this stuff. Don't look down upon him. Who knows their status with them? Who knows what they're going through? Invite them to your homes like Ansar did. Let him break bread with him. Let him learn what Islam is. This is how Rasulullah taught us, with this example. There as well. Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan, he lived there. His father Abu Sufyan, he lived there. Miqdad ibn Aswad, he lived there. Miqdad ibn Aswad was a very early Muslim. You don't hear about him a lot. But he says, at one time, I was 1/8 of Islam. Meaning I was one of the first 8 people to become Muslim. So, Miqdad ibn Aswad, again, he didn't have a tribe in Mecca. He was actually from Yemen. He was a black Yemeni. And later on in Medina, I believe it was in the Medina era, he asked one of the Sahaba for his daughter or his sister's hand in marriage. And the Sahaba, and that Sahabi, rejected him on racial reasons or tribe reasons or what have you. So then Miqdad was upset. And he went to the Prophet of Allah and he said, what is this? We're Muslims now. We're supposed to be done with this Jahiliyyah stuff. And then he said, he didn't marry you from his family. He said, come with me. And he married him to his first cousin. Rasulullah's own first cousin. He married him from the greatest family, the family of Rasulullah. So he led by his example. All in total, from his father's side, 10 ams, 10 paternal uncles. Only 4 of them were alive, as the narration I read, when he became a prophet. So 2 of them accepted Islam, 2 of them rejected Islam. The 2 that accepted Islam were Abbas and Hamza. And the 2 that rejected Islam were Abu Talib and Abu Lahab. And there's even some weaker narrations, because Abbas came into Islam way later on, even though he assisted the Prophet, as we mentioned. Way later on, right before the conquering of Mecca. So he said, Abbas, just as the last of the Mursaleen, last of the Prophets, you are the last of the Muhajirin, the last of the migrants. So Abbas, and then a little bit further down is where Ja'far ibn Abi Talib used to live. And Ja'far, you don't hear about him a lot, even though he was an early Muslim. You don't hear about him a lot because, even though he came into Islam in Mecca, because he was the leader of the Muslims when they went to Habasha. So he stayed there, maybe the majority of the Madinah period. So, but they say he was the most similar to Rasulullah khuluqan wa khalqan. He was the most similar to the Prophet, peace be upon him, in his manners and in his physical features. And when he came finally after the conquering of Khaybar to Medina, Rasulullah, of course, hugged him and he kissed him, and this was his first cousin. He was Ali's brother. So then shortly afterwards, he sent him to the Battle of Mu'tah to fight against the Romans. He was second in command of an army of 3,000, just a squadron of 3,000. They were against 100,000 Romans, and some narrations say 200,000 Romans, but at least 100,000 Romans. And he gained his martyrdom there, and Rasulullah was being revealed to him by wahi while he was on the pedestal, and he said, Zayd has gained his martyrdom, Ja'far has gained his martyrdom, Abdullah ibn Rawaha has gained his martyrdom, while he's on the minbar. And then later on he narrated saying, because Ja'far, he was the second in command, so when the first in command died, he took the flag. And then he was holding the flag, and they cut off his hand. Because the flag, at this time, was the symbol of the army. The symbol of the army. It's very, very important. If the flag leaned forward, it means charge. If it leans back, it means retreat. If it falls, it means we're done. So the flag, his hand was cut off. Now, hypothetically, of course, his death was written that day, or his martyrdom was written that day. Hypothetically, he could have let the flag drop and fought with one hand and lived. But he put the need of the Muslims, the army, before his own needs. So he dropped his sword and he took the flag into his other hand until they chopped off that hand. And then he hung on to the flag with his stumps until finally they stabbed him and he gained his martyrdom. And then Rasul said later on that Ja'far right now is in Jannah and Allah has replaced his two arms with blood-splattered wings and he flies with the angels. So he lived there. Since to the Sahaba, they said, Amir al-Mu'mineen, if you want martyrdom, go to the front lines and get your martyrdom. If you want to die in Medina, then stay in Medina. They couldn't understand how you had both. But he had a very beautiful quality. He had husn al-niyya. He had optimism with Allah. Allah says, I am to my slave as according to his optimism of me. If he thinks positively of me, I will be positive. If he doesn't think positively of me, so if we think of Allah as some sort of, miser, and he's like, I'll give you 5 hasanat, I'll give you 2, stuff like that, then that's what we're gonna get. But if we believe Allah is Malik al-Mulk, if we believe Allah is the King of Kings, and He controls all the universe, and He can give us anything, and we make dua with that belief, with that certainty, that's how Allah is gonna treat us. So he asked for martyrdom and death in Medina. And Allah gave it to him. He got assassinated in that very same spot. Also in that generation, and he would make dua for us. He would ask Allah, he would beg Allah to keep us away from the fire till his feet would get swollen, cracked, and bleeding. And he said, describing us, he said, you're going to the fire. He said, you're like moths. You go to the fire. You run towards the fire. And I'm grabbing you by your belts and I'm tugging you back. But you go. And this is his concern, day and night. He thought, how can I save my people from the fire? This is in his lifetime, let alone Yawm al-Qiyamah. Yawm al-Qiyamah, when everything is complete and utter chaos. Bedlam, nervous breakdown. You'll have naked people next to you. That won't even faze you. You see Jannah, you see Jahannam. Reality.